Good evening. Welcome to the Australian Heritage Festival for 2021. I'm Kimberley Meagher. I'm the President of the Victorian and Tasmanian branch of the Professional Historians Association. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands in which we live, work and play. I pay my respects to the Kulin Nation's elders past and present and respect their community's deep connection to the land, sea and country that has spanned tens of thousands of years. A very warm welcome to any First Peoples who are with us tonight, and indeed to all of you who are joining us for this webinar. I am joining you from the Wurundjeri country of the Woiwurrung language group, and I invite you to say hello in the chat, and if you would like, to also acknowledge the country you're meeting us from. I'm delighted to be here hosting tonight's webinar, where we will consider our heritage for the future. We will be hearing from 3 professional historians who will share their experiences working in heritage. They'll talk about the role historians play and how historians can help us better understand our tangible and intangible heritage. And of course, to flip the role of historians who are better accustomed at looking back over time, we've also asked them to consider our heritage in the future. Our speakers tonight include Libby Blamey from heritage consultancy firm Lovell Chen, Felicity Watson from the Victorian branch of National Trust Australia, and Dr James Lesh from the Melbourne University School of Design. All of our speakers are Victorian members of the Professional Historians Association, also known as the PHA. Due to unforeseen circumstances, Tasmanian member Nick Haygarth is unable to join us. All Australian states and territories have a PHA branch and are represented at the national level by the Professional Historians Australia. The Victorian and Tasmanian branch has over 230 accredited historians. There is a nationally recognised accreditation standard, which means our members are academically qualified to bring historical knowledge, objectivity, and strong research and writing skills to history projects. Our members work as independent historians and consultants across many sectors, including archives, education, government, museums, media, and heritage. Members' works include academic, organisation, and local histories, as well as providing specialist history advice to archaeologists, architects, corporate businesses, and developers. The historian's skills are invaluable in documenting, interpreting, and communicating history. You will see on that slide our website address, where you will find more information about us and the work that we do. Our Twitter handle is at PHA Vic Tas, and if you are tweeting, take note of those key hashtags to join in the conversation. Before I introduce our first speaker, just a couple of notes about the webinar. On your screen, there is a Q&A button for all your burning questions, and I hope there are many. You'll be able to see all the questions put to the panel, and you will be able to vote for questions you would like to hear our panel discuss. We won't answer the questions until after the presentation, so feel free to input your questions as you think of them. Adjacent to the Q&A button is the chat button. If you're having any technical difficulties, please use the chat and our event team behind the scenes will try and help you. If the internet becomes unstable during a presentation, the speaker will turn off their video and proceed with audio only. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the PHA Vic Tas website. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, so let's get started. Our first speaker for tonight is Libby Blamey, Senior Associate and Historian of Lovell Chen. Libby is a professional historian with 13 years experience in the built heritage industry. She joined Lovell Chen in 2011 and is now a Senior Associate working in the heritage team. As a senior historian, Libby's work includes researching and analysing a wide variety of heritage places in metropolitan and regional areas, preparing histories for conservation management plans, heritage studies, land use and thematic histories, and predictive archaeological studies. Prior to joining Lovell Chen, she worked at Heritage Victoria, assessing places for the Victorian Heritage Register. Welcome, Libby.
Thanks, Kim. And I'll just bring up my presentation. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm speaking and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So for most of my career as a historian, I've been working in heritage, but I didn't actually come from a built heritage background. My studies at university were mainly related to social history and 20th century history. So for those that are not aware, Lovell Chen is a Melbourne-based heritage consultancy and architecture and conservation practice, which has been around for 40 years, as of a week or two ago, actually. My role is senior historian in the heritage team, and we provide heritage advice on the management of a variety of heritage places. So heritage is an industry which is made up of professionals, advocates, academics, community groups, authorities and owners, amongst others. Within heritage consultancies, you'll find experts in architectural history, architecture, conservation, planning, interpretation, and of course, history. My job is focused on researching and writing about heritage places and assessing their significance. The work of a historian underpins many of the conclusions we reach and the heritage advice that we give to clients. Working in a heritage consultancy as an historian brings about challenges and opportunities, and I think one of the best things about my job is that my research can have practical outcomes for these heritage places. Place is such an important word in heritage, and it's one of its fundamental concepts, but also one that's layered and complex. A heritage place can be anything from a tiny 19th century workers' cottage, like the one in the promotional material for this webinar, large boom era mansions, 20th century factories, university campuses, theatres and racecourses. But more broadly, it can also mean streetscapes and landscapes, city blocks and entire suburbs and municipalities. Places can have meaning for individuals, for groups, for localities, and for the entire state, and even to the entire country and the world. And that's reflected in the clients that we work for too. They can be individual owners and occupiers, developers, local councils, state government departments, custodians, and community groups. So a place can be important for different reasons. Heritage places are assessed against a set of criteria which relate to historical and social, aesthetic and architectural, scientific and archaeological values, amongst others. They can have meaning or value for people walking past every day, appreciating a striking design or a remnant of another century. Meaning for the people who are actively engaged in a building with its day-to-day operation, who may have a long association with the place. And a place also may have value for what it represents about our history, be it at a local, state or national level. And one of the great privileges of my job is being able to talk with people about the places that they love, and through my research and analysis, gain a deeper understanding of the meaning and values of each site. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of places where history was a really important aspect of the work that we were undertaking. So one of the shifts over the past few decades in heritage assessments is the increasing recognition of historical and social significance in heritage studies, which is not at all to say that early heritage studies didn't consider historical value. They absolutely did. But it's perhaps a sense that there was more a focus on grand 19th century architecture and high profile people rather than more modest buildings which may have represented people's ordinary daily lives. So a few years ago, Lovell Chen undertook a heritage study of the Guildford and Hardware laneways for the City of Melbourne. And this area between Elizabeth Street and Queen Street, it's more of a service area to the city. It's less known than precincts, including the retail streets of Collins and Burke Streets or the Courts precinct. It evolved from the mid-19th century with residences and horse bazaars and hotels, stables and shops and sale yards, many of which were associated with the gold traffic along Elizabeth Street. And you can see in this 1860s depiction of that area, it's a much more modest sort of building typology really than perhaps you've got the GPO, which is just being built there. In the interwar period, many of the 19th century buildings, particularly residences, were replaced with factories and warehouses, but the network of laneways remained. So one building that struck us from the outset was this unassuming three-sided bluestone wall to Guildford Lane, Sutherland Street and Maclean Alley. After digging through early rate books, maps, directories and newspaper advertisements, we identified it as the stables of the Bucks Head Hotel, which had fronted Little Lonsdale Street from 1848, but was demolished in the 1950s. In 1853, the hotel's proprietor, John Maclean of Maclean Alley, gave notice of his intention to construct public stables, and it operated as such until the early 20th century. Plans and photographs of the 19th century, such as these ones, show this modest structure, and it's been pretty relatively unchanged since its construction. For a fairly plain and primitive structure, its history shows the important link between this part of the city and the traffic arriving and departing on Elizabeth Street. Such a substantial bluestone structure in this period shows the ongoing need to accommodate horses for travellers staying at the hotel or visiting the city, and the important role of this area in the operation of the growing city as it developed through the gold rush period. Stables such as this would have once been common in the CBD, but are now relatively rare survivors. So this building demonstrates how the city operated not in the grand buildings constructed on the back of the gold wealth, but in the logistics of its day-to-day activities. And on the basis of this historical significance, we graded this plain bluestone structure as a significant precinct and then a significant building, sorry, in the new precinct, and it's now included in the heritage overlay. So history can also add to an understanding of a place, even when the building itself has gone. Heritage, of course, is not just about history. There are many complex considerations at play in managing and adapting heritage places. First and foremost, of course, is significance and the management of values to ensure the ongoing sustainability of a place. So the Princess Mary Club is an example where the broader significance of a site resulted in the demolition of a building, but it's also an example where, as a result of this, the history of that building is now better understood and more accessible than it was previously. And the acceptance of change at this site was informed by investigation and analysis, and although it was contested, in heritage, not everyone reaches the same conclusion based on the evidence, but these conclusions are tested through the statutory processes. So the Princess Mary Club was on the broader site of the Wesley Church complex in Lonsdale Street and part of the recent Wesley Place redevelopment. The Wesley Church is included in the Victorian Heritage Register for its historical, architectural and social significance as an 1850s complex of church, school and manse. And we've been providing heritage advice on the redevelopment of the site, including the conservation of the church buildings, advice on the design of the new built form and interpretation. My role in the project was to prepare a history of the Princess Mary Club, a permit condition for the redevelopment. So the P&C was an interwar hostel building constructed to provide accommodation and meals for young women coming to the city for education and work. The Wesley mission was concerned that these women would fall prey to undesirable influences in the city and provided everything that they would need. And while this place was part of the work of the Wesley Church and the central mission, the assessed values of the broader site really focused on the 1850s church complex. I interviewed 10 former residents of the hostel, as well as undertook archival research to prepare a history of the building and the experiences of those that lived there over its more than 60 years of operation. And the interviews revealed a real commonality of the experiences for the women who resided there. The hostel represented a stepping stone from family life to adult life. But how they felt about the place differed. While some looked back with great affection, others were a bit more circumspect about its role in their lives. And in that way, the history presents a more nuanced record of the women that lived there. And it's a record of people who don't often make it into the official records, or perhaps less visible in history, generally, in this case, young women. One of my favourite quotes from this history was from Marjorie, a resident there in the 1960s, recalling her arrival, saying, "I've made it, I've got my own room." And though the redevelopment saw the end for this building, the experiences and the importance of this place for young women is now in the on-site interpretation, such as here, the online exhibition associated with Wesley Place, and the history is available in the State Library. I don't quite know where this leads for the future of heritage. I think as an historian, it's a really rewarding time to be working in heritage. Places are being reevaluated and identified for their historical, social, and shared values. And recognition is really being given to the lives and contribution of people that perhaps have not been given as much consideration previously. Thank you.
Thank you, Libby. That was great. And I really appreciated the detail in the case studies, particularly about the Princess Mary Club. And I love that quote too. I've made it, I've got my own room. Our next speaker is Felicity Watson, Executive Manager, Advocacy at the National Trust. Felicity is a Melbourne-based heritage advocate who had more than 15 years of cultural heritage experience across consultancy, public history, and the not-for-profit sector. With a multidisciplinary approach across heritage, history, and urban planning, Felicity is passionate about advocating for the protection of places with special value for communities and promoting the contribution that heritage conservation can make to vibrant, livable, and sustainable cities. As an advocate, she also actively works to expand professional and public conceptions of heritage to be more relevant and inclusive. Welcome, Felicity.
Thank you so much, Kim, and thank you so much to the Professional Historians Association for convening this event and for having us. It's really exciting to present to this audience, and it's great to see so many familiar names in the participants list. I would also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the place from which I am speaking to you today, the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation. I also pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend those respects to any elders or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be watching this presentation. So a little bit about me and my, I guess, engagement in the history profession and the heritage profession. I would say that I'm a generalist and not necessarily an expert, unlike many of the people who are speaking to us tonight and many of the people in the audience. I am really interested in the space where heritage, history, planning and stories intersect and navigating that space. As an advocate, I rely heavily on the advice of experts, including expert historians, to advocate for the protection and the appropriate management of heritage places. And that expertise and its role in heritage is a really important part of the work that we do. And I look forward to highlighting a few examples of that that I've been involved in recently. I got involved in heritage at a very young age, straight out of high school, and I was driven by a passion for history. I didn't know that the heritage profession existed, that there was a whole system in place to protect heritage places. So my discovery of that system was really exciting from a young age, and I really developed a passion for how history is present in the landscape, both in layers that are visible and that are invisible, and the way that the heritage profession and discipline facilitates an understanding of that and the management of places. And I'm also really passionate about connecting communities to their heritage, or in raising awareness of, conversely, the heritage that communities have and the stories that they hold. So for me, that developed into particularly an interest in heritage interpretation and storytelling, because I think it's really important for histories and for heritage to be understood by as many people as possible in order to be handed down to future generations. So that's just a little bit about me, and I will take you through a few case studies that kind of highlight aspects of that. So building on what Libby spoke about, history obviously has a central role in the management of heritage places, and Libby illustrated some of the ways in which that happens. History unlocks our understanding of place, and it helps us to work out how to manage those places and communicate their significance. Best practice for heritage management is set out in the Borough Charter developed by Australia ICOMOS, and this diagram is just an illustration of the Borough Charter process, which shows the steps that you go through in order to plan for the management of a place of cultural heritage significance. And history really is pivotal to all of these steps. So first of all, in informing the understanding of a place or an object and an assessment of its significance, and then informing the management of that place in terms of physical fabric, and understanding of which fabric is important and how it should be managed, and how that place, what the history of that place is, and also how it should be interpreted to the public as well. And importantly, an important part of this process is the periodical review of the history and the management of a place. So I think something that is really important to note is that once you have written the history of a place, it doesn't mean that that history is set in stone. Our understandings of history obviously change over time, and that's something that we see reflected in the work of historians from generation to generation. And it's the same for heritage. It's something that needs to be revisited to incorporate broader conceptions of our understanding of history, to tell new layers of stories, and to really ensure that the understanding and the management of those places remains relevant into the future. So the first case study I want to look at is the Hoffman Brickworks in Brunswick. This is an industrial heritage site that is of national significance. And there's a little bit of information there on the screen about its significance, and there's lots of information online if you're interested in finding out more about the history of this place. But recently, in my role as a heritage advocate, I've been advocating for the protection of this historic site, which is now the site of a residential development. It's a development which has been in process for a number of years and which remains unfinished. And there are a range of serious heritage management issues associated with this site. But that's a story for another time. For now, I want to focus on the role that historians have played in my experience of this site and in the advocacy process for its protection. Like many industrial sites, the fabric of Hoffman's brickworks and the history of the site is difficult to understand without some form of interpretation. These recent images show different parts of the site, including one of the kilns, some machinery which isn't quite in context, and the former brick pressing shed, which is now dilapidated and therefore inaccessible to the public at the moment. So it's a challenging site for someone who doesn't have any context to look at and understand how it works and why it's so significant. There's also an image there of some of the interpretation on site, which provides residents and locals with a bit of an understanding of what's on the site. But in order for me to understand this site and its history, I had to get an understanding, first of all, of the documented history of the site. So my first source was the very comprehensive conservation management plan, which was prepared by Helen Lardner in 1999, and a number of other people contributed to that as well. But often the conservation management plan is the base document for the understanding of the history of the place and how that history informs its management. So that was a really important source for me to look at to understand what was happening on this site. But there's also, in relation to this site, a really rich source of information, which we are very privileged to have access to, which is from a community group called Save the Brickworks, which is a group of residents and leading heritage experts who have been advocating for this site's protection for many years. And it was really through these sources that I was able to start to get an understanding of how this site actually worked. So through historical images and oral histories, Save the Brickworks have assembled this, this archive of information, which really explains how the buildings worked and why they were significant, using the voices of the people who worked there. This information is really important, not only to inform decision-making about the site, but also to help the community to create connections to that place and to preserve a living record of this important part of our history. I think it's interesting that in this context, regarding this site, historians have played an important role, both professionally through the provision of advice to the developer and the owner of the property, but also through a community activism role. I think Save the Brickworks has been absolutely vital in continuing the campaign to save this site and to protect the fabric of this site, which, as you can see from my previous photographs, has been deteriorating over time. And so I think that the community history that's associated with this site has been a really important resource that's been kind of outside the, I guess, professional advice that's been provided as part of the statutory planning process. Another really important aspect and role of historians in the management of heritage places is revisiting the places that we think we know. So going back to that idea of revisiting histories and rewriting histories, with changing historical understandings and the importance of exploring and acknowledging different perspectives, we need to keep revisiting the histories of our heritage places. The National Trust recognises the importance of this in relation to our own sites. And in recent years, we commissioned a cultural heritage survey of the Old Melbourne Jail, which was undertaken by archaeologist Darren Griffin and historian and heritage consultant Abby Cooper. So it's well known that the Old Melbourne Jail operated between 1845 and 1924, and it's probably best known for its association with Bushranger Ned Kelly, and that's why a lot of people visit the site. But the place is really much more layered than that. This report explores our understanding of Aboriginal people's engagements with the site following the execution of the two Tasmanian Aboriginal men, Tunnerminnerwait and Malboy Henna, on the 20th of January 1842, who were the first people hanged in Melbourne. So this project went back to the archives and went back to look at the history of the site through another lens. And our consultants looked at records including criminal trial briefs, the Victorian Prisoner Index, the Central Register of Male Prisoners, and other archival sources, including historic newspapers and Norfolk Island convict records. And what they found was really a number of individual stories which highlighted the historical events of this period, not just within the Old Melbourne Jail and the City Watch House, but across the entire colony of Victoria. The stories that they uncovered as part of this research involve numerous historical themes that are important to understanding Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal relationships in Victoria, from contact with Europeans to the present day, and particularly the period of the frontier wars and the experience of resistance fighters and other Aboriginal men who were incarcerated at the Old Melbourne Jail. So this history is really important. It's important for our understanding of this place, and it is important for the management of this place. And this report isn't currently publicly available because further consultation needs to be undertaken with traditional owners in order to ensure that that history is appropriately told. So we're now up to the next stage of the process of the project, which will involve a further analysis of the criminal trial briefs. And this is a project that's being funded by the Public Records Office of Victoria's Community History Grants, which is really exciting. And the purpose of this is to take this study a step further to inform the management of the Old Melbourne Jail and recommend selected case studies for use as part of an interpretation and engagement program to be available at Old Melbourne Jail and online. And part of that process will be engaging with traditional owners about how to appropriately tell those stories, and also in order for us to provide the archival material that we have found as part of this research for their own records as well. So handing back those stories and sharing that understanding. And another example of recent times of a project which casts another light on heritage places that we think we know is the Victorian government's history of LGBTIQ+ Victoria in 100 places and objects. And that was undertaken by the Australian Queer Archives for the Victorian government, and fantastic leading historians involved in the preparation of this report. And what I really loved about this project is that it tells the stories of a community which has been historically marginalised. It tells stories that have always existed but have not always been known and understood. And it also allows us to understand historical layers of places that we know and that are part of our historic fabric, and that may be recognised for heritage significance for other reasons, but it adds to our understanding of those places. So places like Parliament House, Collins Street, St Kilda, this report really sheds new light on places across Victoria, and is, I think, a really great kind of visionary project about the future of heritage practice and the role of historians in heritage to tell these stories and to engage with different communities, particularly those stories that haven't been told or have been marginalised in the past. So this is something that I find really exciting, and congratulations to everyone involved in this. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Felicity. That was fantastic. It's so valuable to see heritage through the lens of advocacy and just how vital it is for the preservation and appropriate management. And particularly, we get a sense of the value of the inclusive histories as illuminated in your case studies. And also how you showcase our own members, you know, Sarah Rood and Chris Johnson and Abby Cooper, all PHO members there. Thank you.
Sorry, absolute legends, all of them.
Fantastic. So, our final speaker for this evening is Dr. James Lesh. James is a historian specialising in urban and cultural heritage at the Australian Centre for Architectural History, Urban and Cultural Heritage in the University of Melbourne School of Design. He's interested in the capacity for urban and cultural heritage to facilitate placemaking, community participation, sustainability, and design. He advocates for a dynamic mode of heritage conservation that addresses the present and future challenges of our cities and societies. Welcome, James.
Thanks, Kimberley. I'll just share a PowerPoint. Great. So hi, everyone, and it's really good to be here tonight and also to follow those two really interesting presentations from Libby and Felicity. I'd first also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations on whose unceded lands I come from you today. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging and any Indigenous people with us today. So to introduce myself, I'm an urban historian and heritage researcher based in Akahatch at the University of Melbourne, the Australian Centre for Architectural History, Urban and Cultural Heritage. So for the last decade or so, I've been researching the role of heritage and heritage contestation over time to shape cities, places, and people's lives. So my next publication is a co-edited academic collection exploring how we can research and understand historic places and people's emotional attachments to them to improve heritage and community outcomes in heritage. I also do urban historical research into places like Federation Square, and I'll have Federation Square on a few of my slides today, a site I'm sure is familiar to all of you, or most of you. And I'm currently writing an academic book about the emergence of the heritage system in 20th century Australia, which will hopefully be coming out early next year. So my paper will bring together a little bit of conceptual, a little bit of applied aspects of my research into the discussion. And I want to say from the outset, it's a bit of a provocation for us to consider the value and role of history and historic value in heritage and conservation today. And I say that because I think many of us intrinsically know that history is fundamental to heritage and places. But I think it's also really, really important for us to, particularly in the current environment, to continuously be able to re-articulate and reinforce this value. And I say this for the risk of historical concerns and community concerns being sidelined in decision-making and in conservation outcomes, which can sometimes occur. So to do this, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the value of history has been understood within the world of conservation. I'm going to do that I'm going to tell this as a story from a historical perspective. So in Australia, I think as Felicity mentioned before, heritage conservation is guided by a doctrine called the Burra Charter. That was first drafted in 1979, most recently revised in 2013. And the Burra Charter tells us about that process that Felicity spoke about how we should go about doing conservation. And it's endorsed by all the major players in conservation, the architects, the planners, historians, the authorities, voluntary and professional bodies. And it tells us in summary, that the role of conservation is to safeguard historic significance or historic value alongside aesthetic, scientific, social, scientific, and spiritual significance or value. And I want to ask, why is history special? Why did we get to be the lucky ones that got a value in heritage? And we can look back and examine within conservation why that's the case. And aesthetic and historic value had been the traditional two values of conservation coming from Europe since at least the 19th century with the emergence of the modern conservation movement. And Emeritus Professor of History at Monash University, Graham Davison, has taught us in this influential pamphlet, What Makes a Building Historic, that what makes a building historic is its basis as an architectural antique or a memorial or shrine or as a social document. So it gives three really interesting reasons. So again, we can accept historians are fundamental to the process of conserving places of heritage because of our understanding of historic value there. But I think that would be to skip over the tensions that have existed around articulating what historic value is and what the role of history is or might be within conservation. And I think doing so is important because historians have not always been openly welcomed into the world of conservation. So it isn't a coincidence that the same year that Davison wrote that pamphlet, Miles Lewis, Emeritus Professor of Architectural History at the University of Melbourne, conjured the character of the ugly historian. And by the way, Lewis was a lead author of the Borough Charter. So he said, architectural bias in conservation really actually made a lot of sense. The role of heritage is to conserve architecture, buildings and structures. So the bias towards architectural considerations in the assessment of buildings, so often bemoaned by us historians, is natural enough. Furthermore, the importance of people and their activities is not necessarily reflected significantly in physical remains. And finally, he wanted to take a bit of a shot. Historians are arrogant about their standards. And I guess this is the provocation. Is it possible that Miles Lewis was right? And I'll return to that question shortly. So following that critique in the 80s and 90s, a specific role was designated for historians within conservation. Historians would prepare a particular type of history, the thematic history. And the thematic history became really typical inclusions at the start or end of heritage studies and conservation plans. And I've got the image there of the former Australian Heritage Commission's thematic framework, as well as the cover of a heritage study from 1998, prepared by Lovell and Associates for the City of Yarra. And that thematic approach for understanding sites and areas was to be framed against the historic theme frameworks defined by authorities. And on the slide here, it's the current themes that are still used in Victoria, the ones that animate the work of historians today. And we can actually start to look into where these themes came from. And where they came from was actually from the field of historical archaeology in the 1970s. And really, they haven't been updated a whole lot since the 1990s, even though we use them today. And there have been recognised issues with the thematic approach. In fact, Davison wrote about that a couple of decades ago. He said in this rather evocative paragraph in the Use and Abuse of Australian History, he wrote, while promising greater rigour and inclusiveness, they also lend themselves to remote and bureaucratic application. The rest upon a process of classification that comes more naturally to botanists and zoologists than historians. Rather, the best way of establishing the importance of a building or site, the historian would tend to argue, is by telling a rich, evocative and complex story about it, not by classifying it under a preconceived theme. So the suggestion here is that the use of historic themes can be reductive when they're applied to heritage places, even though they need to be within the statutory frameworks, and that they reduce our capacity, therefore, to tell meaningful and deep stories about people and their heritage places. And I also think there's another more contemporary issue with the historic theme framework as well. They respond to a kind of history and a way of telling stories that may have had currency, say in the late 20th century, but is not necessarily how we narrate and practice history today. As I think I've already said, the historic themes are quite old, and the themes were addressing the historic and social concerns at that time, some of which may or may not be of relevance today. But to give you a very clear example, the fact that we're all an urban country on Indigenous lands has not been fundamental to the historic themes or the values of heritage in cities, towns, and built environments in Australia. Yet history today is being shaped by new Indigenous histories, and it's also being shaped by new environmental histories and new histories of diversity and social justice, to name just a few strengths in the historiography that could potentially have more of a role within the practice of heritage. And there's another thing related to history and historic value in conservation that I also wanted to highlight. So I promised I'd come back to Lewis's ugly historian challenge head on. And that's to pose the question, the provocation, do historians actually care about cities, towns, and places? And by this, I mean, I include their embodied experience, their material culture, their architecture and design. Like, I suspect the answer is often yes, we see these as important. And I make this assumption because people are fundamental to making heritage places, just as people are fundamental to history. And in that way, history can be a sort of a triangulation between place, people, heritage, and value. And we've already seen in the earlier presentations the way that history can animate heritage practice, the way the historic value can operate, the way thematic histories work, and in particular, they work to actively contribute to the tasks of identification and interpretation. And when I say identification and interpretation, we're talking about, in a sense, the front end and the back end of the heritage management process. But let's talk about the middle bit of heritage management, the kind of conservation decision making around the site. And I think that history and historic value does less well in finding a role for itself in the actual conservation of material fabric, of places, and in decision making related around this. And to overcome this, I think we need to start thinking more about history and historic value as having an unrealized capacity to explicitly contribute to conservation decision making. So put differently, historians can do well to recognize value and significance in heritage places, including when those places may appear to lack integrity or authenticity in terms of their physicality, their materiality, and historic fabric. And by doing so, if we can start to articulate that for places, historians can even contribute even more to heritage places and their conservation. So I'll give you an example. At Federation Square, we can draw on the history of the site to argue that its conservation requires an unencumbered civic plaza. And that can occur even if physical and architectural aspects of the site change, such as for the building of the Melbourne Metro Tunnel, which is happening at the moment. Only by having a public and open space can it continue its role to sustain its historic value, along with its social and architectural values. So by that, I mean hosting the Kulin Nations Tanderum or the Homeless World Cup or political protests and moments, and also being a welcoming everyday meeting spot within the life of the city. So any conservation developed decisions that are made for Fed Square might account for its historic value as a fundamental expression of public life and democracy and citizenship. So historic value starts to shape conservation policies and actions in at once the physical and virtual space, and in at once the imagined and lived place as well. And to bring this, to start to bring this to an end, we can build on past articulations of historic value then, I think, within heritage to bring a kind of a fuller and richer version of historic value for the 2020s. And historic value then starts to express the indivisibility between the tangible and the intangible, because people make and value heritage over time through their relationships to place. So I'm suggesting the following takeaways about doing history and heritage. First, historians have the power to bring fresh, historically informed perspectives to conservation. Second, there are limits to the historic themes framework and thematic histories that are commonly used in heritage, and we should consider re-advocating and rethinking the approach. Third, history already has a key role with the identification and values assessment of heritage places, and also with the interpretation and storytelling after conservation works. But if we want to have history to have a greater role, this is the fourth and final point, our challenge is now to also articulate historic value for conservation works in and for and of place. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, James. Your presentation has really rounded up our discussion so far tonight and sets the scene for our panel conversation, complete with a provocation or two for our audience. So I'd like to invite Libby and Felicity to turn on their videos, and while we're waiting for our attendee to post their questions, I will start off with a question of my own. So as part of this Australian Heritage Festival, which opened this week, Felicity, you hosted a panel discussion on Monday that was about the Central Victorian Goldfields World Heritage Bid. And what really resonated with me from that panel discussion with heritage practitioners, Trevor Budge and Susan Lawrence, was talking about capturing the layers of history and telling well-rounded stories that includes negative aspects of heritage places. And so, I mean, of course, this question is for the whole panel, but so often, you know, social history and the various layers that make up history of a place are discarded, you know, for a light touch or representative account. And I think, you know, Felicity, you probably did touch on this a little bit in your presentation anyway, but is there a retrospective need to reinterpret heritage places and to introduce the missing layers and stories? So over to you all to tease that out a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in just to begin with. As I did say in my presentation, I do think that there is a real need for that to happen, and for that to happen as a continuous process, not, you know, I think that the way that our heritage is largely protected is informed by heritage studies and histories that are undertaken at a point in time, either when, for example, a municipality is wanting to protect places of heritage significance, or if there is a development which is proposed for a site. And so often the histories that we have for these places are taken at this kind of point in time. And, you know, they might be sufficient for the purposes of that particular point in time. But they're not finished. They're always unfinished, and there will always be layers of history that we don't know or that haven't been told, and that can change with our access to archival sources. For example, you know, I don't need to tell this audience that the advent of Trove totally changed, was a game changer in terms of uncovering histories of places and people in a way that wasn't so accessible before. So there might be information that becomes available. There might also be communities that haven't told their stories as well. So there's a need to revisit that. And in order to do that, there needs to be a commitment by the people commissioning those histories and the proponents of those histories to look at that. And there have been some really good examples recently. The City of Melbourne's Hoddle Grid Heritage Review has a really rich history that incorporates lots of social history. There's a really detailed component looking at the Aboriginal history and values of places within the Melbourne CBD as well. So I think that sort of set a really high benchmark for studies like that. But it is, yeah, something that's always changing over time.
Yeah, just to jump in as well, I'd agree that heritage studies are a kind of a reflection of a point in time, but I think they are heritage is constantly being remade and reevaluated, and certainly what we valued 30 years ago is shifting to what we value now, and in 30 years time that will shift again. And I think it's for all heritage practitioners that historians certainly have a really important role to play in re-examining sources and places and buildings and trying to get a sense of what actually the value of a place is in certain time periods. So I think it's always evolving. Certainly some recent heritage studies that we've undertaken, I think, again, for the City of Melbourne will, you know, present a more complex view of how these places developed and a recognition of different types of places that perhaps would not have made it into heritage protection previously. Someone doing that same thing in 30 years time may look at what we did and sort of think they missed all this other stuff. So it's constantly evolving, and I think that's as it should be. What we value changes.
James, did you want to add anything further to those answers?
No, I think it's to say, and I agree with Felicity and what Libby said as well, is it's to say that this process of updating and revising and recognizing heritage as being dynamic and changing is really important. And on top of that, if we want to start thinking around issues and questions of decolonising heritage practice, of exploring contemporary issues within heritage practice and making heritage relevant. I suppose we need to take this challenge head on, which I think is starting to occur more and more.
Well, we might turn to some of the questions that have come through from our attendees. So Amanda Wells has asked, so decolonisation has been increasingly important in historical research and writing. Is there a role for decolonisation in the future of heritage as we push for a shift away from the colonial dispossession and violence of the past and present?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and one that has been playing out in, a number of heritage issues across Australia in really prominent ways, and that's been really important for progressing that debate. And the fact is that our heritage protection system is a colonial system. It's imposed. It imposes a certain set of values and assumptions on the places and the histories that we seek to recognise through that system. And so, I mean, for example, one thing that we need to really look at as heritage professionals and as a discipline is how we can expand our ideas about what best practice is to encompass different ways of looking at heritage. So, for example, the borough charter process isn't necessarily very compatible with the idea of self-determination, which is a really important principle that should be driving heritage management of places of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural heritage significance, and which is enshrined in the United Nations policies on Indigenous peoples. So that's something that we really need to look at and to question the, I guess, the orthodoxies of our system and how we can empower Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to make decisions and to manage their own cultural heritage instead of having to go through this Western system that's been imposed.
Thank you. The questions are really coming through now, so we might move on. And so Lucy Bracey has asked, do any of you have any thoughts on how we as historians can get local councils or government to engage beyond the statutory requirements, for example, thematic environmental history? I feel that we work so hard on these reports and then they just sit on a shelf until the next 10 years pass and a new one is commissioned.
Yes, I can probably jump in. I don't know if I've got any solutions to it. I agree, people work very, very hard on the various aspects of heritage studies, and particularly something like thematic environmental histories, which obviously they don't necessarily result in statutory protection of places. That's the other kind of side of documentation, like citations and mapping and that kind of thing. Thematic environmental histories give such a complex and nuanced understanding of a particular place, of a suburb or a municipality, but they don't often get beyond the report. They sort of set up great things for interpretation or trails or that kind of thing. I think, local councils are often very stretched, probably stressed as well. And it is a funding kind of issue, I think, for a lot of them, and a priority for where they've been called to protect places that come out of these studies. The thematic histories, I think there's often really good intents with intentions of moving them forward and getting them to be more accessible. But yes, I don't actually have any solutions as to how we can get that to progress other than advocating for that.
I think it is a really there is a range of issues that have been identified, I think, in the governance of heritage at a local level, particularly in the recent Heritage Council of Victoria report, which is available on their website. And there are conversations around the governance of heritage at a state level, particularly at the moment in New South Wales, where an inquiry into heritage legislation has been announced and a quite controversial discussion paper has been released, which might be potentially setting the scene for conversations in other states about how we go about governing heritage more generally, and could lead to some substantial shifts in directions unknown around the way that documents like that, for example, are used and prepared, because there is, I think, a recognition that there is a kind of a range of kind of disjointed aspects between work that's being done, between community and public expectations, between forms and modes of different forms of expertise, the sort of expertise that heritage is drawing on, traditionally architectural expertise and historical expertise, and also demands it from the development community about how they want to work with heritage places as well, which isn't always necessarily demolishing places, but it might be around questions of how adaptive reuse should be done and appropriate ways to go about it. So I think there's a recognition that how can we invest in heritage in ways that's going to maximise the public benefit of it, and at a local level and a state level, and perhaps that recent report in Victoria and what's happening up in New South Wales as well might start to develop a new legal and policy environment where everything that is produced, I suppose, has more direct value in terms of what's being created for the public and for the community.
Great, thank you. Well, look, I think we're just on 8 o'clock, so we'll just answer one more question. And Leo Martin asks, of the panel, that you all touched on the important role of interpretation in helping communicate the history of heritage places. He was wondering how you see the developments in technology changing the way that sites are interpreted and the opportunities and challenges that this might present.
I'm happy to jump in just to say that I love that question, Leo, and it's an exciting time to be involved in heritage interpretation, because I think traditionally heritage interpretations been very kind of site-based and based on signage and static presentations about the history of places. But now we have all of this incredible technology available to us. We can look at more dynamic ways of interpreting places that incorporate different types of media. So, you know, it's a lot cheaper now to do things like video productions. 3D scanning of places is a really amazing development in technology and is now pretty affordable and accessible through the companies that do that kind of work. So it enables places to be accessible and available to people, not just in situ at the actual sites, but also remotely as well. So it's this opportunity to really expand the audiences that we have for interpretation and to tell those stories to a much bigger audience. Yeah, so only positive things from me to say about that.
I think another thing that technology kind of can enable us to do with interpretation is to update and provide more complexity that perhaps, you know, didactic signs that get put up at the completion of a development and then never get changed for however many years and then forgotten about. Whereas if you're able to direct people to websites or podcasts or that kind of thing, you can convey a much more detailed and complex story, and it can be updated, which I think is quite important. As you know, we're getting more sources accessible, we're reevaluating archives, all that kind of thing, and I think that's a really wonderful opportunity that we have now.
I agree with Libby and Felicity completely. And I mean, technology, like in every aspect of our society, is fundamentally transforming the entire process of heritage, from documentation to works to interpretation. And there was another question that's also come in around education, and so I'll reflect on that in very briefly in relation to technology is that at the University of Melbourne, in our programs at ACAHUTCH, so we have a Masters of Urban and Cultural Heritage, and we also have a series of professional micro-certificates, so short courses for historians and other professionals who are looking to upskill in heritage. We actually have one specifically that's focusing in on technology, and that's reflecting all the really interesting things that are happening in the field in terms of allowing us to approach older problems of heritage in fresh ways, but also to ask new questions of heritage places that we've never been able to ask before as well. And also to start capturing human relationships to place in really, really exciting ways too. And the most obvious of that is through social media, of course, but I'll leave it there because I know we're out of time.
That's great, thank you. And I'm sorry that we can't get 2 more questions because we are just about out of time. This has been a really fantastic webinar. So often I've been to heritage forums and events, and it's not often from the historian's perspective. So personally, I've really enjoyed this angle and hearing all your thoughts and reflection, because whether the history component is research, historiography, interpretation, the provenance is significant, the history component of heritage is critical. So in closing tonight's event, I would like to thank you all for coming along to our webinar. I would like to thank Michelle Blake, Mary Sheehan, Sophie Couchman and Peter Simon, who've worked tirelessly on this organising this event. I also acknowledge the work that goes into this festival, which is spanning right now right across Australia. So a huge thank you to the Australian Heritage Festival organisers. In terms of up and coming events, PHA members should note that there are a couple of spaces left in the Podcasting Essential Masterclass that starts this weekend. So go to the Wild Apricot for details. Another members only event, the hands-on introduction to the GLAM workbench hosted by Tim Sherritt, will be online in May, so bookings will open soon. Finally, a hearty, very hearty thank you to our speakers tonight, Libby, Felicity and James. We're extremely grateful. It's been insightful listening and learning from your experience and spending the time to think about heritage for the future. Well, that's all from me. Good night and enjoy the rest of your evening.